There's been a mistake.
There's been a mistake. These numbers, steward, they do not align.
I only followed orders.
Thomas yanked the mill shutter and stopped cold when the great stones lay still and a grey dust carpeted the floor, where sack should have been whole. Suspicion tightened his jaw before he spoke. He knelt and ran a hand through the scattered husks, feeling metal grit against his palm. The central problem was plain in that first breath. The mill had failed and the village bread might not last the week. Thomas set his cap with a quick, practiced motion and pushed the shutter wider so the thin dawn could judge the room. Thomas had ground flour here for 20 years. He moved with the mill's rhythm by habit, a wrist twist for the chute, a check of the stones, a finger on the wheel of the hopper. And when that rhythm broke, he read its absence as danger. He rose and called without ceremony. Mill stopped, stones cold. "Come look," his voice carried out into the yard, flat with the sort of urgency that drove people from hearths and doorways. A small knot of villagers gathered at the yard gate while the sky paling to dawn. Mara arrived with one child on her hip and a second clinging at her skirts, mouth already asking for bread in the thin morning light. Brother Anselm came slower, his hands ink, stained from the ledger he kept and the small entries he made for the infirm. Each arrival tightened the air. Suspicion in Thomas, worry in Mara, a measured curiosity in Anselm. What happened, Thomas? Mara, setting her child's chin on her shoulder to listen. Her fingers worried the hem of her apron, and Thomas noticed the way she kept one foot ready to step forward, as if to fetch or fight. He met her look with a clipped answer, stones halted, sacks torn, grains ruined. Mara. Look, he tipped a sack and the flour that remained rose in a soft, dull plume, then fell back like grey dust. Brother Anselm crouched and smelled the spoil. He frowned and wiped his fingers on his habit. There is ash here. Not the black of hearth ash, but a pale metallic smell, taste. He asked quietly, the ledger forgotten on his knees. Thomas, hands already carrying a ruined sack to the light, shook his head and said, "Done tea taste. We need an account." "Count what we have left." His voice held the miller's command, practical, urgent, raw with that suspicion that drove him to act before fear could freeze him. Word moved before noon. By the time Lady Eleanor arrived, the yard was crowded with neighbors and small children nosing the edges. She came with the pressed air of someone who managed lists and kept the Lord's household in order, a leather ledger at her hip and a bronze brooch on her chest. She did not pause long at the gate. She stepped into the mill doorway, eyes fixed on the ruined sacks. "Open the ledgers," she ordered. Her words were clipped, precise. Thomas stepped forward. "Open the ledgers, Thomas," he said, incredulous. "These sacks were full when I locked up." He met her look, and she held to her posture, hands folded. "The castle sent a requisition last night. I must inspect the store to account for it." Her voice did not try for softness. It had the weight of obedience, and of the castle-less pressure behind it. The villagers bristled. Mara's hand tightened on the child's sleeve. A woman near the gate spat a single word that held a lifetime of small resentments. "They always take more." Thomas matched the glare aimed at the steward and said, "Lady Eleanor, we need to know if this is theft or demand." He did not use the word paranoia. He let his suspicion show in the way he kept his shoulders forward and his hands ready to work. Brother Anselm opened a torn sack and found pale ash speaking from within. He held the torn cloth up to the light, rubbing a thumb along the edge where minute flakes clung. "Look here," he said, the syllables slow and careful. "This residue isn't tea from the hearth. It has a bitter edge. Someone might have sabotaged the sacks, or there was a fire under the grain. We must consider both." His voice was low, an attempt to frame the facts rather than inflame the crowd. Mara stepped closer to the doorway where a thin sun stripe fell across the floor. She put the child's weight on her hip and looked at Thomas. Thomas, last night I saw someone by the granary. They had a torch and moved quick like. I nearly woke Tumka. He woke anyway. I thought it a fox. She tapped the kerchief at her waist, fingers pausing on the small leather pouch. I didn't look close, but the flame was wrong. The villagers muttered. Her report shifted the room. Suspicion turned to accusation and then to the hard edge of fear. Voices rose in a small animal chorus. Who was it? Why would they burn our grain? If the castle takes what it wants, we'll have nothing. Thomas raised a hand for silence and walked the rows of sacks with Brother Anselm at his elbow. He checked seals, fingerprints, the pattern of ash on the cloth. Each small detail fed his suspicion, and he used the ledger as a tool. Count the sacks with me, every one. Lady Eleanor, stand here while we tally. Then tell us what the requisition demanded. He spoke like a man who wanted answers, not catharsis. Lady Eleanor removed the cord from her ledger and unrolled the sealed requisition. She read aloud without effect. 10 extra measures to the castle barracks by the next market day. Her mouth was a fine line. The villagers' faces sank. Thomas spat a muted sound and said, 10 extra measures we did not set aside. We would not have been able to fulfill that without warning. Who signed this? He pushed forward, palms flat on the table, waiting for a name. She tapped the seal and answered, signed in the Lord's hand by order of the steward. I delivered the notice at dusk. Her eyes flicked to his face. Thomas, I do not write the orders. I enforce them. The villagers' anger had a sharp edge now, and one man called for fairness. Brother Anselm interceded, lowering his voice and placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder as if the touch might steady more than one person. A woman stepped forward then, a neighbor whose husband had been conscripted last year. Lady Eleanor, my children have been without porridge 2 days. If the Lord asks more, where will we turn? She did not wait for an answer. Her voice carried the raw edge of want. Thomas met Mara's eyes, and the two of them exchanged a look that said the same thing without speech. Protect the mill, protect what can be fed to small mouths. Thomas moved to overturn a sack, searching for anything missed. When his fingers hit something hard beneath the dust, the yard went quieter. He drew back the cloth and a small bronze household brooch rolled free and struck the floor with a dull sound. The metal caught a sliver of dawn and lay there like evidence. For a breath no one spoke. Then accusations unfurled. Is that from the Lord's household? A man demanded, did a servant take it and drop it here? Lady Eleanor, is this yours? Thomas' voice taut. The steward's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the brooch, and she pushed her palm over it before anyone else could touch it. Her precise folding of her hands came back into the room like a practiced maneuver. Lady Eleanor's face tightened. She turned the brooch between thumb and forefinger, and someone in the crowd whispered the name of the household it bore. Thomas watched the small motion in her fingers, the way she tilted her head and then lowered it, a tiny concession. This could be a dropped token, she said, voice even, or a sign of a servant's misstep. It does not name a thief. Her words only inflamed the villagers who wanted clarity now, not nuance. A rapid exchange broke out. You were here with the requisition last night. Thomas, you had access to the records. Who saw the ledgers? Brother Anselm interjected. Thomas, speak plainly. Thomas answered, Lady Eleanor, did anyone from the household come to the granary last night? The steward's jaw worked. No one authorized to remove grain did so without my order, she replied, but I will look into the household staff, the back, and... Forth sharpened like a knife, 3 to 5 quick lines where accusation met deflection. Mara stepped in quietly, voice steady though the child's hand clutched her apron. Lady Eleanor, if the castle asks for more, tell us plainly. If someone took from us in the night, name them. We cannot beg and keep our mouths closed. Her words were not a demand for revenge. They were a practical plea. Thomas felt the village press at his shoulders as if they wanted him to act for them. Brother Anselm tapped his quill on the ledger and said, write names. I will record who receives what tonight." He looked up at Lady Eleanor and added, "Lady Eleanor, seal whatever you must, but give us a clear accounting by dusk." The steward hesitated, then nodded. Her face showed a decision made under pressure. She would open the household to inquiry, but within the castle's procedures. Outside the yard, a child cried for bread. The sound landed in Thomas' chest and pushed him forward. He set his cap more surely and said, "I will guard the stones tonight. If someone comes, I will know." His hands moved to the mill door. The villagers murmured approval. Thomas felt a shift inside him. Suspicion sharpened into a protective resolve. He assigned tasks with short sentences. "Mara, take the ration list. Brother Anselm, record names. Eleanor, bring your ledger to the green at noon." Each instruction tightened the plan. By mid-afternoon, Lady Eleanor produced a sealed requisition she had received and set it on the small table in the yard. Thomas inspected the handwriting and the wax. The seal bore the Lord's mark. The signature looked real. He traced a fingertip over the letters until his nail caught on a smudged ink line. "This was folded and folded again," he said. "Someone handled it roughly or late. It could be forged, but forging a Lord's seal is dangerous. Why would anyone risk that?" Brother Anselm tapped the ledger and said, "We must assume both pressure from above and opportunism below. Both can harm the village." His voice measured the two forces and left Thomas with a heavier task than simply watching the mill. A mid-afternoon discovery changed the tone. A servant's shawl, small and singed at the hem, was found where the granary path met the hedgerow. Mara craned her neck and said, "I found it by the bramble when I fetched water. I thought it a rag. I didn't think to bring it." Thomas took the shawl with gloved hands, smelling the same bitter tang as the flour. The possibility that someone from the Lord's household had been at the granary moved from whisper to possibility. The crowd pressed forward. "Lady Eleanor, explain this shawl," someone demanded. The steward's face closed. She tucked the brooch back beneath her cloak as if to hide it from claim. "I will question the staff," she said. "But I ask you, Thomas, not to lay charges before inquiry." "You will only inflame the village," Thomas answered without lowering his voice. "Lady Eleanor, my concern is the children's bellies. Inquiry or not, we must keep watch and feed what we can." His answer turned the argument away from blame and toward immediate survival. Evening came with a close, pale sky. Lady Eleanor arranged for a temporary distribution and wrote a short list of names with measured handwriting. Brother Anselm read the names aloud and marked them in his ledger. Thomas counted and measured the small portions he could spare and handed bags to the women who would take them home. Mara accepted a ration with her chin tucked, the child's fingers tightening around her sleeve. As dusk fell, the village settled into uneasy plans. Thomas posted himself by the mill door with a lantern and the milling hook at his belt. He checked the bolts and listened to the wooden frame for any small sound. His suspicion would not leave him. He sat with it like a companion, watching the yard and the dark lane. Brother Anselm stayed to write his notes and offer a small blessing for those who took portioned sacks. Lady Eleanor rode away toward the castle with the ledger under her arm, her posture composed but her shoulders taut. Before Thomas could draw the last plank closed, he heard a soft footfall at the far end of the lane. He rose and moved the lantern to the slit, where he might see without giving his position away. A figure slipped between two hedges, torchlight mistaken for a passing shepherd. Thomas gripped the mill hook. He felt the emotion inside him shift again, the suspicion flare into cautious alarm. He whispered, "Who's there?" The footfall stopped. There was a pause long enough for Thomas to count his options and short enough to make his chest beat faster. Then a voice answered, small and quick, "Thomas, it's me." Quiet. "It's Mara." The figure stepped into the light and she stood with a small bundle caught to her chest. Thomas did not lower the hook. He simply exhaled and let the lantern's light fall on her face. Mara's eyes were wide and earnest. She set the bundle down and said, "I found tracks. They head for the lane toward the castle. not the fields. I thought them fox prints until I saw the smaller impressions under the heel. Someone came through here after dusk. Thomas bent and made the comparison with his own hand. He watched the way her fingers trembled when she pointed toward the castle slope. Her fear read as action. She had left a child at home to trace footprints in the mud. Thomas felt the crowd's pressure pass across his shoulders one more time. He set the mill hook in place and said, "Stay here. I'll watch the stones. If you speak with Brother Anselm, tell him to copy the name list twice. And Mara, hide the shawl. Do not let anyone else see it yet." She nodded and stepped back into the lane, moving like someone who had put down a heavy thing and then picked up another heavier duty. Night came thick and close. Thomas settled by the stones, listening to the small creak of the mill's frame and the distant hum of the village's last hearths. He kept the lantern low and his thoughts lower. His suspicion burned, but he showed it as steady motion. Patting the stones, checking the bolts, shifting the lantern's flame so it would not glare at anyone passing beyond the yard. Every scrape of a cart wheel or scuff from a boot pulled his attention away from sleep. When the bell from the castle tower tolled the hour, Thomas felt the call like a small pressure against the village's throat. He did not like the sound. It tied the night's events to the Lord's sphere and suggested that decisions above would be made without the yard's presence. He jotted in his head the names Brother Anselm had read earlier and rehearsed the count. He planned a watch rotation in short sentences, then reconsidered and wrote the names on his palm instead. Before dawn, Thomas heard a distant horn from the castle, a low sound meant to summon men. He rose, set the lantern down, and closed the mill door with a hand that did not shake. Outside, the smudge of torchlight on the road showed two riders leaving the castle toward the east. Thomas' pulse picked up and his suspicion sharpened into a precise dread. Decisions in the castle would reach the village in the morning, and those decisions might not favor them. He stepped into the yard where the air held the smell of cold flour and embers. Mara waited by the gate, cloak pulled tight and the child's cheek pressed to her shoulder. Brother Anselm joined them with the ledger under his arm and a line of names written twice. Lady Eleanor had not returned. In the thin light, they made their small council. Measure out what remained, guard the mill, and demand a formal inspection at the castle if necessary. "Thomas, we will not allow any more sacks to go uncounted." He sounded older and firmer. Mara answered, "I'll go house to house tonight. We'll share what we must. Thomas, if you see anyone near the granary, strike your mill bell thrice and then open the door. Do not confront them alone." Brother Anselm nodded and wrote the instruction in the ledger. The three of them exchanged quick lines, well under 5 each, the plan forming by speech and small, precise gestures. They closed the village routine around that plan. Thomas felt his suspicion settle into steady vigilance. The brooch under Lady Eleanor's hand remained a question that altered trust and could change the village's fate if tied to a servant or to the household itself. Whatever the next day brought, Thomas would stand the night as the mill watcher. A gust moved through the yard and lifted a scrap of sackcloth where the ruined pile had been. Thomas bent, picked up a tiny burnt flake, and placed it in his palm. He did not speak of what he felt. He threaded the scrap into his pocket and walked to the mill door. Behind him, Mara folded the ration in a small cloth and placed it where a child might feel the warmth for a while. As they prepared to part, a distant rider's clatter grew louder on the road toward the castle. Thomas heard leather creak and a raised voice calling far off. He lifted his lantern, and the light shook across Brother Anselm's ledger. Mara gripped her child's hand and turned toward Thomas. "Watch well," she said, simple and unadorned. Thomas nodded and set his hook in the ready position. The chapter closes on a clear, concrete beat. A rider in the castle colors appears over the rise and urges his horse forward, a courier likely bearing news. Thomas tightened his fingers around the mill hook and set his lantern down beside the stones, ready to meet whatever orders the castle would send in the morning. Thomas slammed the service door so hard the latch jumped and a spoon rattled on the shelf. He held up a torn sack with flour streaming from a jagged seam and grit crusted along its lip. "Who moved this?" he said. Suspicion sat in his throat and pushed every word outward. He did not wait for the steward to answer. He dropped the sack onto the table. White dust spilled over the ledger and the table's warm wood. Lady Eleanor snapped the ledger closed with a single, practiced motion. She folded her hands and measured her breath before she spoke. "Tumours," she said. "Show me." Tumas turned the sack so the grit fell in a small heap on the table. He shoved his palm into the mill dust on top and let metal filings crumble between his fingers. "Not village grain," he said. "Metal in the husks." The stones were ruined. "I found this by the wheel," he the place and the time plainly. The morning Thomas first found the mill stones stopped and the floor carpeted in grey dust. Brother Anselm glanced down at the grit and did not speak. Lady Eleanor pushed a lamp nearer and opened the ledger on the table. Her fingers were steady when she turned pages. "Where did you last see whole sacks?" she asked. The room smelled of baking and beeswax. Thomas answered with short facts. "At the mill last night." He looked at Lady Eleanor. "I left the shutter at dusk. This morning the stones lay still. The sacks were torn. There were tracks, not ours." Lady Eleanor read the ledger 2 lines at a time. Her mouth tightened. Brother Anselm drew the lamp closer and tapped the page with a stained fingertip. "These tie the entries end here," he said, then a blank. "Then numbers resume in a different hand." Thomas's suspicion sharpened into a demand. "Someone took our grain," he said. "Someone who knew the schedule." His voice caught at the last word. He pushed the heap of grit toward Lady Eleanor so she could see the tiny scorings of metal. "Do not name anyone yet," Lady Eleanor replied. Her tone was clipped, but not unkind. "We must look. We must be certain." Brother Anselm leaned closer, ink still visible on his fingertips from the morning's copywork. He touched the margin where numbers had been scraped away. "This was altered after it was written," he said. "Different ink." Different shortened. A servant at the doorway peeked in and then hurried across the hearth to lay a tray down. Mara pushed through the outer courtyard gate without waiting for permission. Her hands smelled of earth and boiled roots. Her apron was threaded with straw. She came with a single urgent sentence. "Please, Mara, bread for my children. The storehouse is empty again." She dropped her basket at Lady Eleanor's feet. Her voice shook, not from fear but from need. Lady Eleanor looked at Mara and then at Thomas. She folded her fingers and read the faces. "Show me the storehouse," she said. They walked the short way to the Lord storehouse. Thomas led with a lamp. The door creaked where wood had swollen from damp. Inside, sacks sat in ranks, but many were punctured and thin. The air tasted of old grain and damp straw. Mara ran her hand along a sack and let her fingers sink into flour that had been sifted thin. "This is not enough for a week, Thomas." He set a torn corner of sack beside the ledger and circled the grit finger marks with his thumb. Someone moved loads at night. Someone who knew which sacks to take. Lady Eleanor closed the door quietly. She did not speak for a moment. Her jaw worked beneath her skin. "If numbers do not match," she said slowly, "someone in the household altered the record. Not an outside thief." Brother Anselm knelt on the earthen floor and gathered small, dark crumbs of burnt cloth caught in the straw. "There was fire near the wheel," he said. "A token burned in ash." Thomas' jaw tightened. "I saw that token. It had a mark I did not know. I thought it was the Lord's, but it is not ours." They traveled back to the mill with the token wrapped in clean cloth. The path smelled of river and barley. The mill courtyard still kept the morning's grey dust underfoot. Thomas moved with a practical, pained rhythm. He paused at the ruined stones and put his palm on the cold rim of the hopper. Brother Anselm crouched and turned the scorched token between 2 ink-stained fingers. "This stamp is not from this village," he said. "Do you see the notch?" He pointed. "It matches a mark I once saw on a plea from the abbey's tenants near the road." The mark belongs to a steward elsewhere. Thomas frowned, so Grain moved not by chance but by order, he said. He let the word order fall heavy into the hollow where the hopper had been. Mara knelt on the mill cess-stone and set both palms flat on the ground. My neighbors have emptied pans and hollowed ovens for the last 3 mornings, she said. Small children wait by the hearth. They count the crusts. They count the days until the next market. Brother Anselm rose and pressed the token to the lamplight. He held it between his thumb and forefinger like a relic. If a steward's hand is here, then the Lord's household may be losing grain to another account. He tapped his quill against his finger and did not smile. An hour later, Lady Eleanor questioned a servant on the narrow service stair. The servant's shoulders twisted in the tight space. He was young and pale. His eyes moved away when Lady Eleanor fixed him with a precise look. How were night deliveries handled? Lady Eleanor. The servant swallowed. A man with a cloak came at midnight 3 nights past, he said. He left sacks at the back door. He the kitchen boy to keep quiet. I saw him go to the locked storeroom. I did not open it. He glanced at Thomas, then at Mara. I was told not to ask. Lady Eleanor's hands folded. Who is the man? Describe him. She tilted her head. He wore a plain waxed cloak, the servant said, not the Lord's crest. He had a small iron ring on his finger and a short, clipped beard. He handed a note to the steward. The steward read it and put it straight into his chest. The servant's voice dropped. I did not see the mark. Thomas stepped forward. Name the steward, he said. The servant's face went pale. I did not see the steward's face clearly. He kept his head low. He wore the household livery. The boy stammered and then forced one short sentence out. He moved as if he feared being watched. Lady Eleanor did not let him finish. She laid a hand on the stair rail and breathed. You will tell no one else today. You will remain on duty. Do you understand? He nodded. He left hurriedly, shoulders hunched. The stairwell swallowed his footstep. Back in the steward's chamber, Brother Anselm and Lady Eleanor opened the ledger's private chest. The chest smelled of cedar. Lady Eleanor eased the lid and drew out a folio bound in rough vellum. She pried the folio open with careful fingers. The ink on some pages had been rubbed away in places. Other numbers had been scored and rewritten. Brother Anselm tilted the lamp and read a single scraped line aloud. 40 sacks recorded, then blank. Then 30 re-entered in a different hand. The shorten matches the steward's style. He uses a hooked loop on his 7. Thomas made a sound that was more animal than speech. He wrote it himself. He said he lied for a hand. He put another tally where none existed. Lady Eleanor's hands moved so precisely they looked like tools. She put the folio down and said, if he falsified the folio, he did so with knowledge of our counts. He used our nights and our names. He expects the discrepancy to be small. He expects us to accept it. Brother Anselm set down the token between 2 pages as if it were a pin. This is deliberate diversion, he said, not simple theft. A sudden knock at the service door interrupted them. They all turned. Thomas' shoulder was still tense from the mill. Lady Eleanor's jaw ticked. Brother Anselm folded his hand over the folio like a shield. A small knock again. Then a voice from the stair mistress, a rider from the manor beyond the ridge, requests audience. He carries urgent word for the steward. The name of the rider meant nothing to the men at the table. But Lady Eleanor's fingers tightened around the folio. Her face did not change, but the light under her eyes shifted. She made a choice in 3 short breaths. She closed the folio and slipped the token into her pocket. She stood and set the ledger back where it belonged, its pages congruent but not explained. Thomas, she said, for now hide small sacks at the mill. Give out only what will keep children fed for 2 nights. Do not speak of this to the steward. Thomas stared at her for a moment. His hands went to his belt. Lady Eleanor, if the steward is stealing, the Lord should know. He should punish, and if the Lord punishes without proof, he will take what remains from every household here. Lady Eleanor cut in. She kept her voice even. You saw the grit. You saw the burned token. We have one folio altered and one servant who was told not to ask. We have no final proof yet. A public accusation will make hunger worse. Thomas' shoulders slumped. He made a sound that was like the edge of acceptance. If I hide sacks, I will be hiding the very thing I grind, he said. I will be the one to touch the lie. Lady Eleanor met his eyes. Then bury the sacks where only you know. Mark them with a milling token you keep. I will keep the ledger as it is. Brother Anselm will write a careful record to the abbey. We will have a witness outside our walls. Brother Anselm removed a narrow sheet of vellum from within his habit. He set quill to ink and wrote with small, exact strokes. I will copy what we found, he said. I will sign it and seal it. The abbey will hold this account. Mara pressed her palms together. Her face, lined with soot from the kitchen hearth, was steady. Please put my name on the list for one sack, she said. My eldest can go hungry tomorrow if I must, but the youngest cannot. Lady Eleanor nodded. You will have it. Thomas will bring it tonight under cover of dusk. He will leave the mill gate open a crack and whisper it to your son. No one must see that night. Thomas worked the mill dark with hands that trembled only once. He moved grain sacks under the stones where the light could not find them. He tied knots he seldom used and stamped each sack with his brass milling token. He thought of the boy who had begged at the gate and of the servant who had looked away. He tasted ash at the back of his mouth and rinsed it with cold water. Brother Anselm walked to the abbey's scriptorium with the folio folded in his scarf. He did not put his hand to the bell, but instead left the folio beneath a cleft of stone by the south gate for the prior to find when he made his round. He wrote every line as he remembered it. The torn sack, the grit, the scorch on the token, the altered numbers. He dated each entry with the morning's light. Dusk found the village lanes full of low voices. Thomas met Mara at the mill gate. He did not speak more than the 2 lines he needed. Here, he said, and he left a small sack on the step. He tapped the token on the gatepost twice. Mara's son stepped from the shadow and took the sack with shaking hands. Mara put her arm around her child without speaking. She carried the sack like a thing of earth and seed. Her mouth made a single line. Her eyes watched the road. In the steward's chamber the folio lay where Lady Eleanor had returned it. The numbers did not change back. The ledger still showed the scrubbed lines. Night settled and cold crept under the shutters. Brother Anselm returned before midnight and found Lady Eleanor at the hearth. The fire had burned low. He handed her the copy he had left at the abbey gate. I placed it where the prior will find it at first light, he said. His voice was quiet. I wrote our names and the token's mark. Lady Eleanor received the paper with 2 fingers and looked at Thomas, who stood by the doorway. You did the right thing tonight, she said to him. You kept bread from the mouths of children. You kept a record away from one pair of hands. Thomas did not smile. He rubbed his palms on his trousers. I will mend the stones tomorrow, he said. I will make sure our bread is not wasted again. They left the ledger closed and the folio in its chest. The house continued its course in silence. Outside, a rider pulled his cloak tight and shouted down the lane. Someone called his name. The call carried on the wind and reached Brother Anselm's ear as he stepped toward the abbey road. He folded the last line of his account and tucked the small packet into his habit. He felt the weight of the token and the ink like a pair of small stones. He kept the stones close and walked toward the gate. A rider's shout cut into the night and drew his head up. He tightened his grip on the packet and started his pace toward the abbey gate, the rider's voice resolving into a single sharp word that pulled him forward. The chapter ends with Brother Anselm hurrying from the manor toward the abbey. The written account pressed inside his habit, and the rider's call trailing behind him down the road. Brother Anselm felt suspicion tighten his fingers as he drew a narrow leather pouch from the child's sleeve and set its fine dust on the infirmary table. He flattened the pouch with one thumb and watched a pale sift of flour spill onto the rough board. The child slept with a fevered breath, cheek pressed to a frayed blanket. The problem was explicit. The flower matched the household sack seal he had seen in the counting room. This was not simple waste. This was a diverted measure. He had worked with records and small comforts for decades, but suspicion rose now as an immediate, physical thing. He pushed back his cowl, tapped the edge of the table with an ink-stained fingertip, and called for the serving girl to fetch water. Brother Anselm did not call for the prior pattern of prayer. He called for a ledger and a lamp. The need to know came faster than the habit of blessing. Anselm carried the pouch to the window and set the lamp between his palms. The flame showed the pouch a stitching and a faint charcoal smudge that matched the household store mark. He whispered a name he did not say aloud before. Thomas. The miller had already found torn sacks and grit in his stones earlier that evening. The two discoveries fit like edges of a folded cloth. Anselm felt the first shift in his feeling, suspicion changing into a steady urgency to trace a rote. Where the measure left the larder, and who received it. He wrapped the pouch in a piece of coarse linen and walked the back corridor toward the mill. The monastery's wooden floors creaked under his sandals. He passed an open window where a child sold by the gate cuffed into a sleeve. He touched the wall with his palm as if to steady the step in front of him. He kept his voice low when he said, "Thomas." "I have something from the infirmary." The miller looked up from a ledger spread over a barrel, palms dusted white. "Brother Anselm." Thomas set the quill aside and wiped his hands on his trousers. He did not wait for Anselm to speak. His face held the same hard line Anselm had last seen when the millstones lay still. "What did you find?" he asked. Anselm opened the linen. Flour sifted around the edge like snow. "This pouch came from a child's sleeve," he said. "The stitch and the mark." "Look." Thomas leaned in, eyes narrowing. He ran a thumb over the smudge and then across the torn lip of the pouch. "That is the Lord's measure stamp," he said. "I saw that same smudge where sacks split in my stones." I told the steward. He would not look at me properly. Thomas's voice carried plain accusation. Anselm felt the second emotional shift. From steady urgency into doubt about where blame belonged. Thomas' doubt sounded like a sharpened blade. The two men compared details, stitch types, the way the pouch had been tied, the number of grains trapped in the seams. Each detail made theft more specific. They walked together to the mill room, lamp oil guttering in a brass cup. The mill's central stone hummed, a low vibration under their boots. Thomas paused to test the axle, then pushed a sack aside. "The sacks have been lighter than they should be these last weeks," he said. "The ledger says one thing, the sacks another." I counted twice and still could not make the numbers fit. Anselm recalled the night Thomas had yanked the shutter and found husks and grit scattered where whole sacks should have lain. He did not repeat the old words. He let the memory supply a concrete fact. "We have a shortfall. Anselm, the pouch from the child is not a random theft. Someone moved measures from the household stores." He watched Thomas's jaw set, watched the miller measure the angle of a broken nail with his eye. Thomas checked the brass milling token at his belt, fingers worrying the metal. "Who would take it?" he asked. "Who would dare move from the Lord's stores?" A footstep smelled of damp straw and worry. Anselm answered by naming places rather than people. "Some relief is moving out." It left traces. The stitch of that pouch, the smudge, the ledger copies. "We will follow the trail to the steward's rooms." They went without knocking to the steward's courtyard. Lady Eleanor had the household ledger open by a lamp on a stone table. Her hair was pinned beneath a modest coif, and she wore the bronze brooch of the household. She folded her hands as Thomas halted at the courtyard threshold. "Lady Eleanor." "Thomas, we need to speak of the rations." "Sacks have been lighter. The mill shows it." She did not look surprised. She kept her head tilted as she always did when listening. "Speak plainly." "Thomas," she said. Thomas set the pouch on the table between them. "This came from a child's sleeve in the infirmary. Brother Anselm found it." The stitching and the mark match the household measures. The sacks are short. Who ordered the subtraction? Lady Eleanor's hands did not tremble. She lifted the pouch and unwrapped the linen, letting a small dust settle on the ledger page. She glanced at the edge of the ledger, then around the courtyard as if weighing the risk in the stone. "Show me the entry you claim is missing," she said. Thomas thumbed an index card and brought forward the mill's tally. "Here, ledger says this much, sacks show less." Weeks, then weeks, Lady Eleanor scanned the numbers and then a corner of the ledger where several tiny marks repeated. Her thin finger traced a line where a faint subtraction had been made and beside it a small symbol, pressed as if with the nib of a quill, a tiny dash and a dot. She closed the ledger slowly. The third emotion shift came across Anselm as surprise cracking into a sharper suspicion. What if this was not plain theft but a deliberate, marked adjustment? I had not noticed that mark before, Thomas. He looked at Eleanor with a bluntness that left no precaution. "Who is making these subtractions?" Lady Eleanor set the ledger flat and said, "The Lord's household keeps relief, sometimes when winters bite. I mark small allowances. They are authorized, though not always recorded plainly." Thomas's next words came sharp. "Authorized by whom?" "The ledger is for the Lord's steward. If you take without record, you could be judged for theft." Anselm watched the exchange and felt a sudden tightening in his hands, a falling away of the earlier assumptions. He stepped forward. "Lady Eleanor," he said, "this pouch came from a child in the infirmary. The child's mother confessed nothing, but the child slept with it. If these subtractions are authorized, then we must understand by whom and to what end. The village depends on grain not only for bread but to trade and keep the mill running. If the ledger is altered, Thomas will be blamed." Lady Eleanor met his eyes. "Brother Anselm, I do not steal from my lord. I make allowances when the steward will not. I have given small measures to families who would otherwise go without. I note them only where I can." Thomas stared as if the ground had moved underfoot. "You gave," he said. "You altered the ledger." Her voice was measured. "I arranged discreet relief. The Lord's granaries are meant for his household, but the steward knows the faces of those who go hungry. I mark where I can, and I ask the mill to take no extra until we can balance a ledger elsewhere." Anselm felt a new complexity in the air. The ledger mark turned the idea of theft into deliberate charity, and the accusation balance shifted toward a moral, even legal, triangle. That twist altered his next choices. He moved from suspicion to cautious negotiation. "Who receives it?" he asked. Mara appeared then on the narrow service path, a child at her heel and a hidden pouch at her belt. She had walked the lane that cut between the village and the infirmary in the dark, the child's a small hand looping through hers. She hesitated when she saw the men gathered at the steward's threshold. Her fingers tightened around the pouch cord, as if the object might slip back through the seams. Brother Anselm saw the sign of someone on edge. Her thumb rubbed the hem of her apron when she thought. She paused and hummed under her breath to steady a child. He had watched Mara pruning the garden earlier that week, watching how she folded a cabbage leaf in the pantry for her children. He knew her small acts of care. "Mara, come forward." She stepped in, eyes quick. "Brother Anselm," she said, voice low. "I did not mean." Thomas cut her off. "You did mean. You were seen near the larder where the sacks sit. Did you take from the Lord?" Mara's hand moved to the leather pouch at her belt. She pulled it free and held it out with both hands, palms up. "I took only to feed my children," she said, "when the last of the cabbages failed. And the pasture gave less, I could not watch them empty. I left what I could at the infirmary, and when Brother Anselm took the child, he took what I left. I did not want to steal. I wanted to keep them alive." The courtyard filled with the sound of a ledger page turning. Lady Eleanor's face softened for the first time. "You should have come to me," she said. "I would have found ways." Her voice held a caution that immediately hardened. "But I will not see the villagers starve to protect a steward's pride." Thomas spoke quickly. 3 short lines of accusation and fear. You put me at risk. You put the mill at risk. The Lord could order the mill closed if his stores vanish. I keep the stones turning so they may eat. If the Lord calls for a reckoning, I answer for the numbers. Lady Eleanor put a hand on the ledger and looked directly at Thomas. Thomas, she said, I do not hide this from you as a slight. I ask you to help keep the mill turning. Accept a small risk so 100 do not go without. I will take the blame. I will not let you be punished for a choice made to save people. Thomas' voice went low. You will take the blame. If the steward finds out, he will answer to the Lord. I will lose more than trade. My trade could be taken. The exchange grew sharp. Words were short and clipped. The argument went back and forth in 6 quick lines. You for help and did not tell me. Thomas, you ask me to hide it now. Yes, Lady Eleanor replied. Thomas, we do this quietly. You keep the mills counting as we instruct. Brother Anselm keeps the record in the infirmary. You both look to keep the numbers plausible. I place a mark so that later we balance it with incoming tithes. The steward must not know. Anselm measured the risk in the room by watching Thomas' hands. He knew the miller's pride, the way Thomas paused to listen to the mill's rhythm as if it were a living thing. He watched Thomas wipe his flour, dusted hands on his trousers before speaking. These were not abstract feelings. They were exact movements. Mara pressed the pouch to her chest. If you will do this, I will keep silent. I will work quicker. I will bring herbs to Brother Anselm when I can. I will not be a trouble. Lady Eleanor set her jaw. You will not go hungry while I wear this shame. But you will not take more than needed. If you are found taking more than a measure, I will have to report it. Do you understand? Mara nodded. Yes, my lady. The confrontation under the battlements reached a sharp point when the steward arrived, lantern raised like an accusation. He stepped into the courtyard without preface and saw the table, the pouch, the ledger. He barked at Lady Eleanor for the disturbance. He reached for the ledger as if to claim authority. The steward's arrival was the chapter's climax in every sense. Voices rose, hands moved, and the risk of violence tightened into a single possibility. Thomas stepped between the steward and Lady Eleanor. This is wrong, he said. Someone is moving the Lord's grain. The steward's reply was quick and small-fisted. Who speaks of theft? He demanded, if there is theft, I will have names. Lady Eleanor held the ledger closed. We have been balancing care with duty, she said. We have allowed small relief where the steward refused to see hunger. I bear this choice. But if you accuse the mill or the monastery without knowing the ledger's marks, you will ruin more than a name. The steward's face tightened. He reached for the ledger, opened it, and his eyes stopped at the tiny recurring dash and dot. He frowned at the penciled subtraction beside certain weeks. The steward's hand hovered. He looked at Lady Eleanor and then, briefly, at the dark houses that clustered beneath the castle's shadow. Who authorized those marks? He asked. There was a long, held breath among them. Thomas felt his fingers go numb from the standstill. Mara's child began to cry, a thin noise that underscored the risk. Brother Anselm stepped forward. Lady Eleanor kept a record for relief. He said plainly, she has been directing small measures to those in need. The steward's mouth tightened. He turned to Lady Eleanor and said, You put the household at risk with private accounts. The Lord will not forgive such clandestine handling, she answered in a small, chosen cadence. I will accept blame. But if you strike at the mill for the shortfall, the village starves and the Lord's household loses steady bread. Think of the choice you will make. The steward's hand slowed on the page. For a moment, no one spoke but the child's cry. Then the steward closed the ledger and folded his arms. We will not make a spectacle tonight, he said. Lady Eleanor, you will account for this tomorrow to the Lord as steward in private. Thomas, you will keep the mills counting precise to the mark we agree. Brother Anselm, you will note any new cases and bring them to me. If any new theft occurs, I will act. The steward left with a measured step. Once his boots passed from the courtyard, the tension loosened but did not vanish. The fourth emotion shift settled in, relief tempered by a wary fear that the arrangement might not hold. After the steward's departure, Lady Eleanor spoke in a voice stripped of its public form. "I had hoped not to be found out tonight," she said. "I thought I could manage the small allowances without the steward's inspection. I am sorry for putting Thomas at risk." Thomas looked at her, then at Anselm. "If you instruct me, I will follow," he said, "but I will watch the mill. I will not let the stones slow. If a Lord's agent comes with writs, I will be honest, but I will tell the truth that I did not take." Brother Anselm set the wrap pouch back on the table. "I will record the cases that come to the infirmary and keep a private tally. I will bring what I find to you first, Lady Eleanor. I will not let a child's life be the first proof in a trial." Mara pressed her fingers against her throat and then folded them into her apron. "I will work the garden harder. I will not take more. I will not be a cause of more trouble." They made a quiet plan in the hearth, lit back room of the steward's house. Lady Eleanor outlined small rules, limits on allowances, an agreed sign in the ledger where she would mark relief, and a discreet schedule for Thomas to manage mill counts, so that the numbers balanced over time. Brother Anselm agreed to check the infirmary shelves daily. Thomas promised to keep the mill's rhythm and to bring any discrepancy to Anselm by morning. Mara accepted the uneasy safety and the fresh fear that came with dependence on secrecy. Anselm measured what secrecy asked of each of them. He wrote a short note to himself and tucked it into his prayer book. A list of names who had come to him tonight, and the small amounts they had needed. The note smelled of candle wax and his own ink. It was a concrete thing he could hold if the steward demanded proof. Before they left the steward's house, Lady Eleanor took Thomas' wrist and set a small brass token, one she kept for discreet transactions, into his palm. "When you see a mark like this on a sack," she said, "do not show it to the steward. Balance it with a later arrival. Keep the stones turning." Thomas looked at the token and at the ledger, then at Anselm. He nodded once, a short, decisive movement. "I will keep the mill turning," he said. They parted in the cold night with the arrangement in place but not settled. Mara slipped back toward her narrow path with the child pressed to her shoulder. She touched Anselm's sleeve and said, "Thank you, brother. I will not forget this night." Anselm watched her go and felt the final emotional shift, from urgency and accusation into a quiet, guarded responsibility. He closed his hand around the wrapped pouch as if it were a small, living weight. He set it into the infirmary chest and blew out the lamp. Outside, the mill turned as it always had. Thomas paused a moment beside the stones and listened to its steady sound. He ran his flour, dusted hand along the rim of the wheel, and then walked toward the mill house, the brass token heavy in his fist. Inside, Lady Eleanor returned to the ledger and made a tiny, careful subtraction beside this week's line, pressing the ink dot so the mark would look like others. She did not write names, she only wrote amounts. Brother Anselm stood at the infirmary door for a long minute, feeling the notch of sleep and the leftover tension behind his eyes. He laid the ledger entry next to the child's pallet and smoothed the linen. A knock came then at the infirmary door, light and urgent. A neighbor with a fevered child he could not carry alone. Anselm moved to open the door and said, "Come in. Bring the child." The chapter closed not with a speech, but with action. The plan was set, the ledger marked, and a new request appeared at Anselm's threshold. He stepped forward to lift the neighbor's child, the leather pouch wrapped and quiet in the corner, and the responsibilities of their compromise settled into the work of the next day. Lady Eleanor raised the torn sack with 2 steady fingers and said, "This was promised to the Lord's table." Suspicion tightened Mara's hands at her apron as the courtyard gathered. Soldiers shifting, a steward half hidden by the great door, a few neighbors craning to see Mara. The steward said, voice dry, "Where is our measure?" The accusation landed in Mara's chest like a stone. Her immediate problem was plain: Livy's unpaid, children to feed, and now public shame. Suspicion had driven the first movement of the night. It pushed Mara forward to answer, to stop the accusation from turning into something worse. Mara stepped out from the crowd with the kerchief at her neck tucked tight. She knew the look Lady Eleanor kept for household errors. Precise, measured, a face that listed losses like sums on a slate. Mara's reply came in the next breath. "Lady Eleanor, I brought my share this morning at the gate," she said. And her voice did not wobble the way it had when Thomas first found that the stones lay still back at the mill. That earlier day had left grit under Thomas's nails and doubt in the ledger. It lived now in the faces around the courtyard. Thomas's discovery at the silent mill, stones stopped, sacks split, had already changed the way people counted their bread. Lady Eleanor did not lower the sack. "This sack was meant for the steward," she said. "This seam was not torn by mice." Someone cut the measure. She placed the sack on the table by the garrison and pushed it forward. The torn seam showed a thin line of grit along the lip where flour had rubbed away. Soldiers leaned in. Mara looked at the seam and then at Lady Eleanor's hands. She heard Brother Anselm's footsteps at the infirmary arch as if arriving on a bell. The crowd waited for a movement. Mara felt heat rise, not from shame alone, but from the fear that a wrong answer might seize their cottage stores. "Lady Eleanor." Thomas called from the lane, breath rough. He came in with a bundle of sacks over his shoulder, flour dusting his shoulders like a pale shawl. "These sacks were split yesterday at the stones," he said. He set them down hard and turned the inside out so the torn seams faced them all. He spoke the mill's facts as he would read the wheel. Who had come, what grain had been milled, how many turns the stones had taken before the shaft loosened. Look at the grit. Thomas, rubbing his palm along the seam and leaving a grey line where metal had scraped. This was not a careless tear. Someone altered the measure. His voice was low, certain. Mara heard Thomas and felt another emotion move through her, shame flipping into something like anger. She did not shout. She stepped forward and put her hand on one of the sack's Thomas, she said, naming him because names anchored people when accusations flew. "What did you see at the mill?" Thomas' eyes did not soften. He blinked flour from his lashes, then said, "I found the main shaft loose. A wedge was taken. The stones would have ground and ground to dust if not for the repair I made." He let his words sit. The crowd murmured. Brother Anselm, standing by the infirmary arch, pressed his thumb to an object tucked in his palm, a child's leather pouch. Brother Anselm moved forward with the pouch like a man bearing a small relic. "This was behind the infirmary bench," he said. He placed it on the table and opened it with slow fingers. Inside lay a scrap of rough paper with ink marks, a child's token, and a tiny dusting of flour. He smoothed the scrap flat. The ink formed a shorthand dots and marks that Anselm traced with a quill. "Tip finger, the marks repeat the steward's tolling mark," he said softly. These measures were noted in a way only the steward uses. Mara watched his ink. Stained fingertip tap the line as if it were a music score. The courtyard shifted toward a new understanding. Where before they suspected error, now they suspected intent. Lady Eleanor took the scrap with 2 fingers and compared it to the ledger she carried under her arm. She flipped pages until a familiar mark stood out. "This matches my entries," she said, "but my numbers and the sacks do not align." "Someone has been diverting the weight." She looked up at the steward. Her eyes narrowed. The steward's jaw tightened, and for the first time his countenance showed strain. "I can only hold so much in a household ledger, Lady Eleanor. If someone alters measure, then the household fails and families suffer." She folded her hands. "Steward, explain this." The steward opened his mouth and then closed it. He did not speak. The steward's silence pushed the scene toward private pressure. Later, behind a pressed curtain in a narrow service corridor, Lady Eleanor would corner him, but not yet. Outside, Mara moved with her children in mind. The courtyard had made the village a public ledger. The crowd's eyes recorded everything. Mara felt another shift in feeling. From anger to a morbid, practical fear for the night's bread. She did not leave the courtyard without asking one short question. Thomas, will the mill run tonight? She allowed so the soldiers would hear that she had a plan before she might be ordered taken away. Thomas looked at the repaired shaft in his mind and then said, I can mend the wedge, but I will need light and an extra hand. His voice held a steadiness that asked for trust. Someone in the crowd muttered about punishment, about confiscation. A soldier stepped forward and said, if measures were changed, the Lord will want action. His words were a blade. Mara tightened her hands on her apron and remembered the morning the mill had been still. Thomas yanking the shutter and finding a dust-carpeted floor where sacks should have been whole. That memory had been a hinge. It now turned to open suspicion in every direction. Mara could not let the steady hand of the household take her hearth, because some ledger mark had gone missing. Anselm's scrap produced a small twist that the crowd did not expect. He found a child's token tucked in the pouch, a worn wooden bead on a string the size of a child's wrist. He held it up and said, this belongs to a boy from the North Lane, Jory's family. The name moved like a small stone thrown into a quiet pond. Ripples reached immediate faces. Mara felt a fresh panic. Jory's mother was a neighbor. The token meant children had been carrying measures home in secret, or that someone had used children's pockets to divert grain. The fear that had sat under her anger lifted into a sharper urgency. Who else might be in danger if measures were siphoned this way? That night, the steward slipped through the corridor to meet Lady Eleanor beneath the pressed eaves. She cornered him with the ledger on the table and the scrap's mark under her thumb. You know these signs, she said. I know you record them. Whoever skims measure for the Lord must be named now. Confess, or I will take this to the garrison. Her voice did not rise. She folded the ledger closer as if closing a trap. The steward's face went pale. Lady Eleanor, you do not understand. I followed orders. He leaned forward. Orders from above. The steward of the Lord as steward told me to adjust weights on certain days. I did what was instructed. If I failed to obey rank. His words hit the ledger like a second accusation. The air in the corridor held a new cold. Someone above the steward might be invoking duty to hide seizure. Mara had not been present for that private bargaining, but word moved fast through the village. She returned to her cottage at a pace that put effort into every step. The lane smelled of damp straw and stew. At her doorway, her children were low, voiced in sleep. She set down the simple bundle she had left at the gate and dropped her hand to a small leather pouch she kept at her waist. Inside was a wooden amulet and a scrap of barley she saved for times of bad measure. She opened the door and found an empty bowl cooling on the table. No bread, no stew. The bowl was not just empty, it bore a smear where a spoon had been dragged across the rim. A small leather token, identical to the one Brother Anselm had shown, lay tucked into her child's sleeve. Mara's fingers closed around the token until her knuckles whitened. The discovery made her throat go dry. Fear sharpened into resolve. She woke the children and pressed a hand to each forehead, counting breaths like a ledger. We will not go hungry tonight, she told them, naming a fact she intended to make true. They blinked and yawned. Mara packed what she could carry, an extra kerchief, a small knife, the amulet, and set out again for the courtyard. The streets were narrow, lamplight cut pools on wet cobbles. She moved faster now, not from panic, but because action narrowed options and kept a person from falling into the trap of worry. At the mill that night, Thomas worked by a single lamp. He laid the new wedge, hammered it once, twice, and then stopped to listen for any change in the shaft's voice. He liked to say the mill had a rhythm, and that he learned to hear when it was pleased. He ran his palm along the shaft and found a shallow scrape, a mark that matched the metal grit he had found on the torn sacks. He scrubbed at the mark with his sleeve and cursed softly. Thomas's anger shifted from professional shame His mill could be sabotaged to a sharper suspicion. Someone had meant to ruin the next grind. He slammed his palm on the wheel and vowed out loud, "Whoever did this will not do it twice." The vow held his voice steady. Mara arrived at the mill as Thomas tightened the bolts. She named him in the doorway. "Thomas," she said, "do you need a hand?" Thomas looked at her and nodded. They worked together in short, efficient motions. One lifted, one steadied, one hammered. Their shared labor changed the room's temperature. Sweat and flour rose into a tight air. Their hands moved in the language of work rather than speech. When the wedge seated, Thomas tested the stones with a small handful of grain and watched the dust run clean. "It will hold through the night," he said. He did not look away from the stones, but someone tried to break us. Mara touched the braid at her neck and said, "We will not let them." Her words were small but meant to be acted upon. At midnight, the courtyard reconvened beneath the battlements. Lady Eleanor had insisted on a public meeting, and the steward stood near the table with his head bowed. The garrison clustered like a wall. Brother Anselm arrived with another scrap, found behind the infirmary tiles where a boy had been retrieving a beaded toy. He laid the scrap next to Thomas's torn sacks and the ledger entry. The scraps, the sack seams, the wedge scraped from the shaft, each piece made a clearer pattern. The steward shifted and then lashed out with a surprising defense. "I did what I was told," he said, voice breaking in a way that admitted fear rather than guilt. "I followed orders from my lord's bailiff." He, the lord, needed extra grain for campaign stores. His mouth formed the last words like a list. The crowd stilled. The claim moved the danger from a single steward to a plan above the castle drawbridge. Rapid lines followed. "Who is the bailiff?" A soldier demanded, "Who you this?" Lady Eleanor, leaning forward. The steward answered with clipped words, "I cannot name him here." "Thomas." "Then who signs the receipts?" "Brother Anselm." "Then why are tokens in children's pockets?" The back and forth ran short and sharp. 3 lines from the garrison, 3 from stewardship, then Lady Eleanor's firm voice cutting through. "If you will not name him, then I will note this in the ledger and speak to the Lord on his return." She opened the ledger as if to mark a condemnation. The steward paled. His shoulders had no answer. Mara stepped forward and faced the steward. She could smell the wax from Lady Eleanor's ledger and the smoke from the torches. "Did you take my measure?" she asked. Her voice had the plainness of someone asking for a fact. The steward swallowed. "Not you, Mara. I took from the household allotment." "I followed orders." He offered his hands as if surrendering them. The crowd's reaction moved like a tide. Some nodded, some hissed. The truth that a campaign had demanded grain changed the shape of blame. It also produced a small, sharp twist. The steward's action was not private theft, but an imposed seizure. That twist shifted how people would respond. The night parley peeled authority open. Lady Eleanor, Thomas, Brother Anselm, the steward, and Mara stood under the battlements, where torchlight threw long shadows. Soldiers wrote names into a register. Words that had been accusations hardened into decisions. Lady Eleanor took the steward's ledger and, in a voice low enough for few to hear, proposed a temporary redistribution for the village, small bowls placed on doorsteps, a rationed pot at the mill for the next 2 nights, and an order that no household stores be seized without 2 witnesses. It was not mercy as charity. It was a calculated act to hold families steady until the Lord returned. Mara felt relief like a small, usable thing. The fear that had tightened her jaw loosened enough to let her think of her children sleeping on the straw mattress. Her emotion shifted again, now toward guarded gratitude and toward wariness. Gratitude because the immediate danger was eased, wariness because the source of the levies was not settled. She looked at Lady Eleanor and said, "Thank you." The 2 words were quiet but meant more than they sounded. Lady Eleanor inclined her head and turned the ledger outward, marking pages where the master's orders would be questioned on his return. Before the courtyard dissolved, Thomas one more thing that made the crowd quiet. Whoever gave orders to take grain left a mark on the household accounts. Someone signed receipts or notes. Find those hands, find the name, Brother Anselm added, and check children's pockets. People hide food for a reason. We must know why. The combination of practical steps set the next dawn into motion. Ledger checks, house visits, and a slow audit of measures and marks. Dawn brought a fragile reprieve. Soldiers distributed small portions from the mill's emergency stock while Thomas kept the stones running. Mara walked home with a small sack of flour issued by Lady Eleanor for the night. She held it to her chest like a compact thing. The village had not been absolved, far from it, but the public confrontation had forced at least one check on arbitrary seizures. The steward's claim that he acted under orders left a new problem. If the Lord's officers were taking grain for distant accounts, then the village's hunger was an official policy, not mere theft. Mara paused at her doorway and looked at the children's sleeping faces. She placed the sack by the hearth and set a spoon into the bowl. The spoon clacked once against the rim, an ordinary sound in a house full of small necessities. She felt tired in the way hands do after a long day's work. Thomas came by the mill to make sure the wheel ran smooth, and Brother Anselm made a quiet circuit to the infirmary to note the names of families with sick children. Lady Eleanor returned to the ledger with a new line to add. Audit requested on Lord's orders. She folded the page and set the quill down with a small, measured movement. Mara sat at the table and fed her children a thin porridge, stirring slowly so the pot would not scorch. She put the token Brother Anselm had shown beside the bowl and smoothed the child's hair with a thumb. Her actions were small and purposeful. Fold the kerchief, tie the pouch, count spoons. The chapter of accusation had closed on a specific, concrete decision, temporary redistribution, and an audit to follow. That decision left a taste like dry bread, sustaining for the moment, but not rich enough to fill the weeks ahead. Mara kept the wooden amulet against her palm and felt the carved edges by touch, a reminder that she could act, and that action could change the ledger of a life. Outside, the castle doors remained shut until the Lord returned, and the steward avoided the courtyard where eyes watched him. Thomas tightened his mill bolts twice more before the sun rose fully, checking the shaft like a man checking a child. Brother Anselm wrote the night's events into his slim book with slow, clear script so the record would stand. Lady Eleanor walked the lane and paused at Mara's gate, meeting her eyes plainly. I will not let the household take what belongs to children if I can help it, she said. She did not promise miracles, she offered a ledger and a plan. Mara nodded and answered, we will keep our names on the list of those who need bread. The words were not a vow of revolution. They were a pragmatic record. The village resumed its small routines with a new caution. People spoke the steward's name more often. Thomas barred his mill doors at dusk, and Brother Anselm checked pockets in the infirmary for any other tokens. A mid-morning search turned up another scrap hidden in a dowry chest, a small receipt that matched the mark Lady Eleanor had found. The evidence piled into a clearer shape. The seizure had been ordered, recorded, and partially hidden by a steward who now feared his superiors. The twist, that the problem came from above the steward, rather than from the steward alone, had changed the village posture from accusation to a plan of resistance in small, legal steps. That evening Mara sat by the hearth and sharpened a wooden spoon. She could feel the night's events in her hands. The lifting of the sack, the press of torches, the ledger's weight. She had moved from suspicion to anger, then to fear, then to a focused resolve to protect her children. Her choices had been small and public. Speak, return, join the mill, take what measures could be taken. The night had not concluded the story of the levies. It had only ensured the mill would turn and the children would eat for now. The final line of the night's ledger was concrete and immediate. Lady Eleanor had filed a formal note demanding an accounting when the Lord returned, and Thomas would inspect the mill daily. Mara put the wooden amulet back under her apron and closed the door softly. The bowl on the table waited with the remnants of porridge. From the courtyard, a soldier's boot sounded on the cobble as he made a round. The last sound of the chapter was not a flourish or a promise, but a small, practical thing. The rustle of a ledger being set in a shelf, and the sound of a door latched for the night. The village had kept its hearths for one more day, and the ledger had a new line to track the names of those who might take grain under orders. That line would be read again when a higher voice returned to answer for what had been ordered and taken. A soldier seized Mara's wrist and hauled her from the cottage before dawn. "Where is the flour she stole?" The steward's emissary demanded, voice low and precise. Suspicion tightened Mara's fingers at her apron. She had not finished tying her children's shoes when the door crashed open and neighbors pressed to see. Men with leather jerkin shoulders held lanterns that punched warm circles into the mist. A small crowd formed with damp hair and sleep in their faces. The accusation filled the yard. Missing grain, a torn sack, a village owed its bread. Mara answered without pleading. She folded her free hand over the wooden amulet at her waist and spoke in short sentences. "I did not take their grain," she said. "I gathered roots and shelled beans." Ask Thomas about the mill. Her voice was steady. Her limbs moved in practical habits, handing each child an extra cloak, tucking a bit of bread into small palms. Because action had kept her children alive through the late frosts. The immediate problem rested in plain terms. A sack had split, flour had streamed, and someone had to explain where the Lord's allocation had gone. Thomas was already moving toward the gate, nails dark with flour, a torn sack slung over his shoulder. He had not yet washed the mill off his arms. The edge of a flour, dusted sleeve caught on a nail as he pushed through the crowd. He spoke first to the soldier nearest Mara. "This sack came from the service yard," he said, holding the ragged seam so the white spill showed. "It wasn't torn on the road," his voice cut the morning. People leaned forward. The steward's emissary studied the sack, then narrowed his eyes. Someone in the crowd hissed that Lady Eleanor had raised the torn sack for the Lord's table days before. Another voice called out that Brother Anselm had found a child's pouch with fine dust in the infirmary. The remembered events snapped into the present without explanation. Mara's jaw clenched. She stepped away from the soldier's grip and kept breathing in measured counts, the same way she counted furrows when she sowed seed. Thomas turned to Lady Eleanor, who stood on the flagstones near the manor steps, hands folded with the same precision she used when she oversaw the household stores. "Lady Eleanor," he said, throat low, "this sack is not from the road. Flour dust tracks lead from the service yard through the back passage." Lady Eleanor folded her hands and examined Thomas. "Thomas, leave me the sack," she said. "You know how the steward records allocations. We will sort this with the ledger." Thomas stepped closer so his flour, smudged face was nearly level with hers. "We'll sort it in the courtyard," he said. "Bring the steward and the ledger now." A soldier shoved at Thomas's shoulder. Thomas did not flinch. He pressed his palms to the torn fabric, then to his chest where his milling token hung by a frayed cord. "If the Lord's grain doesn't reach our ovens, there will be no bread at dusk," he said. The words landed like a tool struck on wood. Neighbors shifted. Brother Anselm arrived at the infirmary doorway, damp shawl around his shoulders and ink stains on his thumb. He carried a narrow leather pouch clenched in one hand and a scrap of paper folded against his chest. He had found both items a night earlier when he had tended to a fevered child. The child's small sleeve had been damp with sweat, and the pouch had a fine dust inside. Anselm moved with a monk's economy, his steps measured and quiet. He held the pouch up so the morning light touched the seam. "This was in the child's sleeve last night." Brother Anselm, voice low. "I flattened it on the infirmary table." A sift of flour came out. He unfolded the scrap of record and laid it on a stone near the steward's table so everyone could see the cramped handwriting and the numbers beside them. See the allocations here. They do not match what the steward's ledger shows for the villagers. The sound of a page eased over the crowd like a small bell. Murmurs rose. Mara moved closer to the scrap and read the numbers with Thomas, though she had not learned the steward's handwriting. The digits did not lie. A line showed grain debited to the garrison, and another line listed the household's ration in smaller amounts than the village expected. Mara's hands flexed. Her breath came in short, quick pulls. Lady Eleanor's face did not change at first. She stepped aside and let Brother Anselm spread the ledger page on the steward's table. Then she leaned forward and read each entry, her thumb tracing the inked numerals. "This looks like a corrective entry," she murmured, then louder, "Steward. Explain these allocations." Her eyes went to the steward, who had been silent until then. The steward's mouth tightened. He kept his fingers curled around the ledger, as if the book were both weapon and shield. "Lady Eleanor, I only follow orders from above," he said. His voice held a practiced calm. "The garrison must be fed. I recorded the allocations as instructed." Thomas stepped in. "Whose orders?" he asked. "From the Lord himself." "Who signed this?" He pointed at the handwriting. Bronzing light from a torch crawled over the ink and showed a signature like a clumsy mark. The steward's reply was a half, turned toward the soldiers, a small attempt to redirect the energy. "We have to keep the garrison supplied. They protect the castle and the road." His eyes flicked to each soldier, as though counting where loyalty might lie. A neighbor spat into the dirt. "They protect the Lord, not us," someone shouted. The crowd edged forward. A child began to cry. Mara pressed a hand to her mouth and forced herself to breathe. Suspicion, then anger, moved through the crowd in thin, audible waves. Lady Eleanor stepped away from the table and took the steward by the sleeve with quiet force. She led him down the narrow pantry corridor where only a single candle burned. The corridor smelled of beeswax and dried herbs. A rack of jars stood with labels for salt and juniper. There the argument turned private but sharp. "You diverted grain without telling me, Lady Eleanor." Her voice held the household's exacting steadiness. The steward's fingers trembled. "No, Lady Eleanor. I kept the entries correct for the Lord's allowance." He tried to look apologetic. "Orders came for the garrison's needs. We cannot risk the road being left undefended." He made the point small and practical, as if necessity excused the ledger's lines. Lady Eleanor's jaw worked. "You signed away what the villagers counted on. We owe bread to those kitchens. You pledged those ears to the Lord's table." She pressed harder. "Who signed for the garrison's extra grain? Whose hand is here?" She thrust the ledger page forward. The steward swallowed. He began to speak, then stopped. His eyes darted to the corridor wall where the household's bronze brooch hung in a small crate of ribbons. He reached into an inner pocket and produced a folded slip of paper, smooth with handling. "Look at this," he said, handing the slip to Lady Eleanor. A direct order from the captain of the guard. He expected the paper to settle the matter. Lady Eleanor unrolled it, scanned the handwriting, and then her face shifted the smallest amount. She closed her hand around the slip. "This is not the captain's hand," she said slowly. "This is scented with beeswax, and the wax used matches the household signet. Someone has moved papers. Someone altered the chain of command." Her words were a cold, concrete observation. She did not say betrayal. She produced the ledger, the sack, the pouch, and set them on the pantry table. Her fingers left small smudges on the page. In the courtyard, Thomas called for an assembly. He set the torn sack before the steward's table and emptied a portion of its remaining flour onto the table's edge, so the white dust made a thin line. He spoke so the villagers could hear. "The mill keeps an inventory. I weigh the grain when it comes. The count that left the tower does not match what arrived in our ovens. Someone has been diverting it." He did not accuse Mara by name now. He accused the ledger and the routes recorded. Mara finally found her voice in the open. She turned to the steward and to the gathering villagers. "I have children to feed," she said. "I took nothing that was for the Lord. I took what I could gather when my bowl was low. Ask Brother Anselm if I brought anything to him. Ask Thomas if the mill measured the flour. Her sentences were small, each line an action that tied back to the work she did. Gardening, mending, shelling beans. She refused to dramatize. Brother Anselm stepped to the steward's table and laid the child's leather pouch beside the ledger. He set the scrap of paper across the pouch so they matched like evidence. The child's pulse was thin last evening, he said. I saw the pouch then. I set it down to test the dust. Flour came out. I did not keep it. I kept the record. His voice was soft but precise. The tilted scrap showed numbers that did not match community expectations. A man toward the back yelled for action. "Bind her!" He shouted at the soldiers. She should answer for every grain missing. The cry rose and more voices joined. A soldier moved toward Mara with open hands ready to seize. Thomas stepped across with a quick motion and placed himself between Mara and the soldier. "Thomas," the steward barked, "step aside." "This is the steward's matter." The steward's tone tried to command authority, but it cracked. Thomas did not step aside, not until we see the ledger plainly. "Thomas, we will not take one woman's life for the household's wrong accounting." His words kept the soldier back. Thomas's band of neighbors closed ranks in small ways, quiet looks, the shifting of feet. Brother Anselm cleared his throat and lifted the ledger page. He pointed at the lines that showed allocations to the garrison. "Here, see. Unauthorized quantities are marked. The signature is clumsy and repeated." He tapped one mark with an ink-stained fingertip. "This shows diversion." He folded the page open so the crowd could see the ledger's spine and the ink across it. At that moment, a soldier stepped forward with a long stride and took the ledger from Brother Anselm's hands. He held it up for the light and frowned. The steward lunged to retrieve it, voice rising. "Give it here now," he demanded. 3 rapid lines broke from the steward and the men near him. "Give it back, Thomas. You dare not hide the writing. The garrison needs food," the steward countered. "The road will be unsafe without it. Then show us the orders, Brother Anselm." The soldier hesitated, ledger heavy in his hands. In that pause, Lady Eleanor stepped forward with a short, exacting motion. She lifted her signet ring and set it on the table. "This ledger will stay here until we have a corrected entry," she said. "If the steward used household wax and not the captain's, he will answer here." The ring on the table was an authoritative symbol. It changed the tenor of the courtyard. The steward's face went pale. He made a sudden, desperate move toward a pouch at his belt where coins might be kept. He whispered something to one of the soldiers, a quick, low, spoken instruction meant to buy him time. "When we leave today," he said, voice sleeting toward the guard. "Those lads near the gate could use a small reward for their trouble." He counted on the soldier's base need. A hush fell over the courtyard. Lady Eleanor's hand did not tremble. She folded her fingers over the signet and held them there. "You offered coins for silence," she said in a level voice. "You tried to bribe the men who should keep order." Her words were not a broad moralizing. They were a direct recounting of the steward's move toward bribery. The steward's lips moved faster now. "Lady Eleanor, I only kept what I was forced to keep. If I kept some back, it was to keep the peace with the garrison. They demanded more than the Lord agreed to spare." He looked at the soldiers, as if to rally them to his tale. "They are rough men. They would take without a written note." His explanation was a small attempt at self-protection. Thomas stepped forward again, his voice like a millstone. "You decided for us without our say. You corrected the numbers and let our ovens go cold while men in the tower ate more." He did not yell. He spoke in clipped, direct lines. "Where is the record of the captain's order? Who signed?" Brother Anselm produced the child's pouch and, with a quiet motion, set it on top of the ledger. "The child's pouch came from a house within the village," he said. "The dust matched the mill sifting. The ledger entries match that diversion. We will not punish a woman whose hands are working to feed her children while the ledger hides the truth." His phrase coaxed the soldiers to look at the ink rather than at Mara. The steward made one last attempt. He leaned close to an older soldier and hissed, "If you restrain the steward now, your men will answer to the captain for failing to keep the tower's stores." He moved his hand as if already counting the coins he had tried to pass. The soldier's jaw worked. He was torn between orders from above, and the ledger held up for the entire village. Lady Eleanor placed a hand on the steward's shoulder and pressed downward, enough to make the man stumble. "You will not use threats here," she said. "You signed. You will answer." She stepped back and called for 2 villagers to hold the steward until the Lord could be informed and the records corrected. "Secure him in the steward's chamber," she ordered. "Do not harm him, but do not let him out of sight." Her voice carried household command and a small, private compassion. The soldiers obeyed. 2 men took the steward by the arms and led him away, protesting that he had only followed the chain of supply. He glanced back once at the courtyard, where faces showed relief, anger, and weariness mixed together. Mara watched him go, her hands unclenching slowly. Lady Eleanor sat at the steward's table and patted the ledger page flat with slow, practical motions. She wrote corrections with steady hand. Numbers moved, allocations shifted, a line added to note garrison allowances that matched the Lord's signed limit. She tied a new string round the ledger. Then she wrote a small note, folding it and sealing it with beeswax from her own stock. She slid the note to Thomas. "Thomas," she said, "we will adjust milling schedules so the mill sends grain directly to the village kitchens each fortnight. Brother Anselm will record the receipts at the infirmary. I will take responsibility for these corrected entries with the Lord. This will not fix everything, but it will stop sudden diversions." Her sentences were precise, each a small plan. Thomas pressed his palm flat on the note. He looked over to Mara, who stood with her children now wrapped more tightly and watching the people move. "Mara," he said softly, "we will set extra threshing this week. I will hold back 2 bushels at the mill until the ledger stays true." His voice showed duty and a tired kind of pride. "We will share with your house and others who need it most until the records are honest." Brother Anselm stepped forward with a list he had written while the steward argued. Names of the most infirm, ages of the children on the edge of hunger, the days when rations ran thin. "These names," he said, tapping the list, "should be first for redistributed grain. I will sign that I received the transfers and watch the children who come to the infirmary." His offer was small, concrete, and already bound to action. The villagers organized in measured ways. A line of hands passing baskets, Thomas instructing on how to measure proper portions, Brother Anselm making notes and counting pulses in his head. No speeches, work, practical decisions that would keep someone alive another day. The steward's restraint was not theatrical. It left holes in the household but spared violent reprisal. People exchanged curt nods rather than embraces. When noon came, Lady Eleanor called for the steward to be led before a small household council. The steward, 2 soldiers, Thomas, Brother Anselm, and a representative from the villagers. She recorded a corrected ledger entry with her own signet applied over a careful sentence. "This entry corrects previous diversions and orders a redistribution to the village ovens," she said, speaking plainly so the record could be read back in any hall. She set a condition. The steward would remain in house arrest until the Lord reviewed the case, and the household would deliver a written account to the captain of the guard explaining the mistake and providing a schedule for the garrison's allowances. The steward's face crumpled into a new expression, less fear, more calculation. He muttered pleas about lost face and the danger of the captain's temper. Lady Eleanor did not answer with proclamations. She answered with an inventory, dates, weights, wagon schedules. Her actions replaced blame with bookkeeping and containment. Thomas and Brother Anselm arranged the mill's shipments. Thomas marked a corner of the ledger with a small brass milling token to indicate direct dispatch to village kitchens. Brother Anselm crossed names off the infirmary list as he translated needs into practical amounts. Mara watched as bricks of labor were rebuilt into a temporary safety net. She felt a relief that was physical. Her shoulders lowered, her palms unclenched. Her children stood close and did not cry. At dusk, the courtyard thinned. The steward sat in the chamber with a thin blanket. He did not speak much. Soldiers returned to the tower with half their answers, but more caution. Lady Eleanor walked back through the kitchen corridor and paused at Mara's cottage yard where the children were setting a small pot on a low fire. She handed Mara a folded slip of paper and touched her forearm in the briefest way. This will allow you to collect an extra measure from the kitchens for a month. Lady Eleanor, it is not much, but it is lawful now. Keep the pouch Brother Anselm found in safe hands. I will investigate who altered the household wax. Her voice was businesslike and her gesture practical. Mara took the paper and folded it into the hem of her apron. Her fingers smoothed the fabric, the same motion she used when tending seedlings. "Thank you, Lady Eleanor," she said. Her voice was soft but not indebted in the way that shapes obligation. It was recognition that a small protection had been won. Thomas walked with Brother Anselm a few paces. "We will change the mill's shift. Thomas, start before the first light. Bring 2 hands to help me. We will measure before the sacks leave the yard and hold a witness for every load." Brother Anselm nodded. "I will sign each receipt at the infirmary when the flour arrives." "I will not be far from the ledger." His voice was small and certain. As the last torches guttered, Mara sat by her hearth with her children and felt the day's events settle into acts. A ledger page corrected, a steward restrained, a small schedule for grain. Her hands moved by habit to pick at a frayed edge of her apron, and she hummed a tune she used when she shelled beans. It was not a promise that scarcity would end. It was a chain of practical steps that would keep their ovens lit for a few more weeks. Lady Eleanor, Thomas, and Brother Anselm met briefly in the steward's yard and signed the corrected page once more. Lady Eleanor slid the folded correction toward Thomas, who tapped it with a flour-dusted thumb and tucked it into his leather belt. He looked at Mara's cottage as the lane darkened. Brother Anselm crossed himself and closed the ledger. The steward's door creaked as it closed behind him. When the courtyard had emptied, Lady Eleanor spoke to Thomas in a low voice. "We have made a repair today. That will show itself in the ovens and the infirmary books." She paused, then added, "We will watch the household wax and who handles the signet." Thomas nodded. And then he turned his head to where Mara's children were counting small coins of curiosity in the firelight. He wiped his hands on his trousers and braided a plan for the mills in the coming days. Brother Anselm walked toward the infirmary with a list and a lamp. Mara closed the cottage door, set the sealed slip in a small wooden box, and pulled her children's blankets up under their chins. A knock sounded at Mara's door as she laid the youngest against her shoulder. She opened it to find Lady Eleanor standing with a small bowl of warm broth, "Food for tonight, Lady Eleanor, and a witness in case someone asks." Mara accepted the bowl with both hands, and the 2 women exchanged no more than the practical words required. Where the stew had come from, who would carry the extra ration, which day Brother Anselm would record the delivery. The steward sat in house arrest that night, not punished with violence, but constrained with corrected books and a promise of accountability. The ledger lay closed on the steward's table with a new ribbon. The village ovens would, for now, find enough grain to bake bread for the children who waited. The village had not been saved by one voice. It had been saved by small mutual actions. Thomas' weight of evidence, Brother Anselm's careful record, Lady Eleanor's authority and willingness to publicize the correction, and Mara's refusal to be a silent scapegoat. Outside, someone stoked the mill's fire, setting it to burn through a short, late shift. In the quiet that followed the day's reckonings, there was no grand conclusion, only the ledger taped closed, the measured sacks counted, and a family kneeling over a single bowl. Lady Eleanor slid a corrected ledger page toward Thomas once more and left him to mark the mill's schedule. Mara laid her children down, smoothed their blankets, and shut the door on a day that had been raw and resolved in equal measures. The last sound in the lane was a measured step on flagstone as Lady Eleanor walked back toward the manor, and the courtyard settled into an uneasy, working peace.